I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought maybe my sister had left something on the stove, but when I ran outside, I froze. Our barn was on fire. Flames roared into the sky, devouring everything we'd built for 4 generations. Our tractor, our hay bales, the chicken coop, gone. I stood there barefoot on the gravel, heart pounding, as firefighters battled the blaze. And standing just across the street, sipping coffee like it was a Sunday morning, was Karen, the HOA president. She smiled. That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. See, the HOA had been trying to destroy my life for months. Fake fines, harassment calls at midnight, bogus complaints to animal control. Even a SWAT team showed up once because someone reported I'd killed my sister. And now, they'd taken it too far. But what Karen and her little army didn't know was that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives, because I wasn't going to roll over. I was going to fight back. And when I was done, there wouldn't be an HOA left to threaten us. What came next was months of malicious compliance, legal battles, and a federal investigation that would blow the lid off one of the biggest HOA scams in the state. So grab your snacks, because this story has everything. Arson, harassment, SWAT raids, millions in fraud, and one ordinary guy who decided he'd had enough. And before we dive in, guys, if you love insane real-life revenge stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you wild stories every single day. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The scorching summer sun blazed down on the quiet cul-de-sac as I leaned against the railing of my porch, sipping a cold lemonade, trying to enjoy the one thing I valued most: peace. Our farm sat just outside the HOA boundary, intentionally so. I had no desire to be part of a homeowners association and their endless rules about lawn heights, paint shades, and mailbox styles. Life was simple here, or so I thought. It all started when Carrie Smith, the HOA president, came marching up my driveway one Saturday afternoon. She was the kind of woman who carried herself like she owned everything her eyes touched. A neatly pressed white blouse, clipboard clutched under one arm, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Afternoon," she greeted, though it sounded more like an announcement than a pleasantry. "Hi," I said cautiously, setting down my drink. "Can I help you?" "Yes, actually. I was hoping you'd be willing to share your RV with some of the HOA board members," she began smoothly. "We have a few families heading out for vacation next week, and since you're right next to us, it would be neighborly of you to contribute." I blinked, unsure I'd heard her correctly. "You want my RV?" She smiled wider, her teeth sharp and glinting in the sunlight. "Just for a couple of weeks. It's standard practice among our members to share recreational equipment like this. You'd really be helping the community." I let out a soft laugh, assuming this was some kind of joke. "Ma'am, my RV isn't community property. It's mine. I bought it, maintain it, and pay for the insurance. I'm afraid I'm not lending it out." Her expression shifted, the fake friendliness melting into something colder. "I don't think you understand how things work around here," she said tightly. "The HOA always shares. It's what's best for the neighborhood." "With respect," I replied firmly, "I don't live in your neighborhood. My property isn't under your HOA. You have no authority here." That didn't sit well with her. Her jaw tensed, and she stomped her foot like an angry toddler before spinning on her heel and storming off down my driveway. I shrugged it off at first, assuming that would be the end of it. Who tries to borrow a stranger's RV anyway? But I underestimated Carrie. Badly. 2 days later, while I was at work, my phone rang. My wife's voice was trembling on the other end. "The RV," she said breathlessly. "It's gone." "What do you mean it's gone?" I demanded, already grabbing my keys. "Someone had it towed. I checked the cameras. You need to come home now." When I got there, my wife had already pulled up the doorbell footage. We watched together as a tow truck backed into the driveway in broad daylight, hooked up my RV, and drove off like they owned it. On the side of the truck, clear as day, was the name, Tommy's Towing. I dialed them immediately. "You towed my RV," I barked. "Sir, I'll need your address to pull up the records," the man on the line said calmly. I gave it to him. A pause followed, then he returned. "Yes, that was authorized by one Carrie Smith from the HOA." My grip on the phone tightened. She's not my HOA president. She has no authority over my property. Sir, he replied unfazed, we were given documents citing a parking violation within HOA jurisdiction. We acted on that authorization. Rage boiled in my chest. Carrie had gone behind my back, forged authority she didn't have, and had my RV taken like it was hers to control. I got the RV back the same day, not without paying a ridiculous fee, but something inside me had snapped. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Carrie had crossed a line. By the time I parked the RV back in its rightful place, my mind was made up. I was going to sue. The following Monday, I was sitting in my lawyer's office with a folder stuffed full of evidence, the deed proving I wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction, the permits for my RV driveway, and the doorbell footage showing the tow. My lawyer, Amanda, sat across from me, flipping through each page with a practiced eye. She wanted the RV for her personal vacation, I explained bitterly. When I said no, she had it towed. Amanda's brow furrowed. She sounds bold, she said carefully, then leaned back in her chair. This isn't just a civil matter. We can go after them for harassment, trespassing, illegal towing, and emotional distress. If we can prove she acted outside HOA authority, we could also open the door for a criminal case. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone was taking this seriously. Within days, Amanda hired a private investigator to dig into Carrie's activities as HOA president, and that's when the floodgates opened. It turned out Carrie had been abusing her position for years. The investigator uncovered receipts showing she'd been siphoning HOA funds to pay for fancy dinners, shopping sprees, and weekend getaways. She'd also been borrowing vehicles, vacation homes, and even boats from other residents under the guise of community sharing, and she'd been bullying anyone who resisted, just like she'd done to me. Amanda built a rock-solid case. Our lawsuit named Carrie directly, not just the HOA, and cited multiple counts of property interference and emotional damages. When we finally got to court, Carrie looked smug as though this would all blow over. But the investigator's report, coupled with testimony from 5 other residents she'd harassed, shattered her confidence in minutes. The judge ruled in our favor. Carrie was ordered to pay back the towing fees, the repair costs for the minor damages, and every cent of my legal expenses. Arrest. Restraining order was slapped on her, barring her from coming anywhere near me or my family. But that wasn't the end. With so much damning evidence, a separate criminal investigation opened against her for fraud, theft, and abuse of authority. By the time that trial concluded, Carrie was stripped of her HOA presidency and sentenced to prison. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The RV, my sanctuary, was back where it belonged. My family was safe. But that wasn't the last time an HOA tried to control me. This was just the beginning. I thought after Carrie's downfall, things would finally calm down. The HOA had voted in a new president, a younger guy named Greg Mason, who seemed far more reasonable than his predecessor. At least that's what I believed at first. For a few months, life returned to normal. My wife and I tended to the farm, the goats bleated happily in their pen, and the chickens strutted around like they owned the place. The RV sat safe in its spot beside the barn, untouched and unbothered. Then one morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. Notice of compliance required. This property is in violation of the community's architectural standards. Remove all unsightly structures and landscaping features within 14 days, or fines will begin at $500 per day. I felt my jaw tighten as I read it. Unsightly structures? Landscaping features? My property wasn't even part of their HOA. I called the number at the bottom of the notice, and Greg himself picked up. Greg, why am I getting HOA violation notices? You know I'm outside your jurisdiction. There was a pause, and then Greg's voice came back smooth and syrupy, like he'd been rehearsing his lines. We've recently extended our community's covenants to include your property. You're now under our HOA. I nearly dropped the phone. Extend? Ed, you can't just annex my land. I never signed anything. Actually, Greg replied smugly, the county approved our boundary expansion. We sent out notices weeks ago. I went silent for a moment, rage building in my chest. No such notice had ever arrived. You can't force me into your HOA, I said through clenched teeth. Greg chuckled softly. You can fight it if you want, but you'll lose. Might as well cooperate and make things easy on yourself. I hung up before I said something that would get me arrested. That night, I dug through county records online, determined to prove Greg was bluffing. Sure enough, the HOA had filed for a boundary expansion, but it hadn't been approved yet. It was still pending review. Greg had lied straight to my face. I printed everything out and marched over to Amanda's office the next morning. She flipped through the documents and shook her head. They're overreaching again, she said. Greg's trying to intimidate you into compliance before the expansion even gets considered. But don't worry, I'll draft a cease and desist by the end of the day. True to her word, the next afternoon, Greg received a formal letter informing him that any further harassment or unauthorized enforcement attempts would lead to immediate legal action. I thought that would scare him off. It didn't. Instead, things escalated. Within a week, HOA board members started parking across the street, cameras in hand, taking pictures of my barn, my tractors, and even my RV. A few days later, I received a second violation notice, this time claiming my unsightly farm equipment was lowering property values. Then came the bogus complaints. Animal control showed up again, citing anonymous reports of neglected livestock. The county health department came back out to investigate contaminated groundwater. Deputies started stopping by for noise complaints, just like before. It was Carrie all over again, but smarter this time. Greg wasn't reckless. He kept his hands clean, delegating everything to the board so nothing could be traced directly to him. My sister was furious, pacing the living room as she held yet another citation. They can't keep doing this. They're trying to wear us down. I nodded grimly. They're hoping we'll give up and sell. She froze, realization dawning. That's it, isn't it? They want the land. And she was right. A week later, a local realtor, conveniently connected to Greg, came knocking with an offer to buy our property at half its value. That's when I knew this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a takeover attempt, and if Greg wanted a war, I was ready to give him one. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Greg's smug face, that fake smile when he offered to help by buying the farm at half price. That was the moment I knew I couldn't just defend anymore. I had to attack. The next morning, I met with Amanda at her office. She was already buried in paperwork, a half-empty coffee cup beside her laptop. They're trying to force you out, she said without even looking up. I've been digging through Greg's filings. There's more here than just harassment. I leaned forward. How bad? Amanda finally met my eyes. Bad enough to bury him, but we'll need proof. That's when I decided to bring back the private investigator who had helped us take down Carrie. His name was Derek, an ex-cop with a talent for finding dirt where no one thought to look. When Derek showed up that evening, he was carrying a battered leather briefcase and wearing a grin like he already smelled blood in the water. Same deal as last time? He asked, leaning against my truck. Worse, I said. Greg's smarter than Carrie. He's careful. No fingerprints. Derek chuckled. Everyone leaves fingerprints. They just don't know where. For the next few weeks, Derek shadowed Greg and his little HOA cronies. Meanwhile, I went on the offensive in my own way. I set up motion-triggered cameras around the entire property. Every fence line, every pasture, every outbuilding. I filed formal complaints against the HOA for harassment and unauthorized enforcement attempts. I started attending county zoning meetings to challenge their boundary expansion directly. But Greg wasn't sitting idle either. One morning, I woke up to find someone had dumped construction debris, broken tiles, insulation, even rusted nails, across our driveway. I called the sheriff's department, but by the time they showed up, Greg's board members were conveniently standing across the street, innocently watching. The deputy shook his head. Can't prove it was them. No witnesses, no cameras. That was the last straw. I installed infrared night vision cameras the very next day. Meanwhile, Derek started feeding me little nuggets of information, phone records, bank statements, emails between Greg and local developers. Turns out Greg was running the same scam Carrie had tried before. Harass rural landowners until they're desperate to sell. Use intimidation, fines, and anonymous complaints to make life unbearable. Buy the land cheap through connected realtors. Flip it to developers for massive profits. But Greg had gone further. Derek discovered a forged document buried in county archives, a fake boundary approval letter, supposedly signed by a zoning commissioner. If Derek could prove Greg submitted it, that wasn't just fraud, that was a felony. I was ready to drop the hammer, but Greg struck first. One evening, I was working in the barn when I heard a splash from the livestock pond out back. I grabbed a flashlight and ran over, thinking maybe one of the goats had fallen in. What I saw stopped me cold. A small shark, yes, a shark, thrashed in the shallow water, tangled in a fishing net someone had deliberately left behind. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing, before spotting the truck speeding away down the back road. Greg. It had to be Gree. Jai managed to cut the shark free and called animal control, but while they handled the mess, one thought gnawed at me. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. Greg was sending a message that nothing on my property was safe. And that's when I decided to change tactics completely. Defense wasn't enough anymore. Greg wanted a war? I was going to give him chaos. The shark incident changed everything. Up until that night, I'd been reacting. Fixing fences, replacing mailboxes, patching up damage. But when Greg dumped a shark into my livestock pond just to prove he could mess with me, something inside me snapped. Defense was over. It was time for payback. The next morning, Amanda and Derek came over. I told them what happened, and Amanda nearly dropped her coffee. A shark? She repeated, incredulous. Greg actually threw a shark into your pond? Yeah, I said flatly. And I'm done playing nice. Derek grinned. Finally. I was wondering when you'd get there. Amanda frowned, though. I get that you're angry, but if you retaliate directly, he'll spin it as aggression. You need to stay clean. Oh, I plan to, I said, leaning back in my chair. But we're going to make his HOA implode from the inside out. Over the next few days, Derek and I went full throttle. We already had evidence of Greg's land fraud, tax evasion, and harassment. But if we hit him with all of it at once, he'd lawyer up and drag this out for years. I needed something bigger, something that would destroy his credibility overnight. That's when Derek dropped the bombshell. Greg's been siphoning HOA funds into a personal slush account, Derek said, sliding a USB drive across the table. Vacations, jewelry, a Tesla, all labeled as community expenses. Amanda's jaw dropped. Please tell me you have receipts. Derek smirked. I don't just have receipts. I have the emails where he brags about it to his mistress. I nearly laughed. Oh, Greg, you arrogant little moron. But then I had an even better idea. See, Greg loved to show off the HOA's luxury pool, his crown jewel, where he hosted those ridiculous cocktail parties for developers and local politicians. Every weekend, he'd invite people over to flaunt the exclusive amenities of his perfect neighborhood. That pool was his pride and joy. And I realized it could also be his downfall. I called up an old friend of mine, Caleb, who runs an aquatic wildlife rescue down by the coast. You still got that juvenile shark? I asked him. Caleb hesitated. You mean the one we pulled out of your pond? Yeah, why? I told him my plan. There was a long pause, and then Caleb burst out laughing. You're insane, he said. But you know what? I like insane. 2 nights later, under cover of darkness, we loaded the rescued shark into a specially rigged transport tank on Caleb's trailer. Are you sure about this? Amanda whispered, standing watch by the truck. Oh, I'm sure, I said, tightening the straps. Greg wanted to play games. Fine, let's play. At 3 a.m., we slipped through the HOA's back entrance. Derek had borrowed the gate code from Greg's emails and made our way to the pool. The tank hissed as we lowered the young shark into Greg's pristine, crystal-clear water. It swam lazy circles under the floodlights, harmless but terrifying enough if anyone spotted it. Then we installed 3 hidden cameras around the pool deck, perfectly aimed to catch Greg's reaction at his next big party. The following Saturday, Greg threw one of his famous HOA galas. Amanda and I watched the live stream from my kitchen as the guests sipped champagne and dipped their toes in the water, until one of them shrieked. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scrambled out of the pool, spilling drinks and flipping deck chairs. Someone yelled, "There's a shark in the pool," while Greg desperately tried to calm everyone down, insisting it was just a prank. But the cameras we planted, they captured everything. Within hours, the video went viral. HOA President Greg invites shark to luxury pool party, racked up 500,000 views overnight. And that was just the beginning. Because while Greg was busy doing damage control, Amanda filed our full lawsuit: harassment, property damage, financial fraud, and land grab conspiracy. At the same time, Derek anonymously leaked Greg's siphoned funds emails to the local news. By Monday morning, Greg's empire was crumbling. Developers pulled out, HOA members turned on him, and the county prosecutor launched a formal investigation into his forged zoning documents. Greg had wanted to drown me in legal threats. Instead, he was drowning in his own mess. Greg didn't go down quietly. If anything, the viral shark video only made him more dangerous. By Monday evening, my phone was blowing up with calls from neighbors, reporters, and even some HOA members who had finally realized Greg wasn't the benevolent community leader he pretended to be. But Greg? Oh, Greg doubled down. At 7:15 that night, he showed up at the edge of my property with two of his board members in tow. I could see the veins pulsing in his forehead, even from the porch. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he shouted, pointing a finger at me like an old-school villain. "You've crossed the line this time, hillbilly. There are federal laws against introducing wildlife into community facilities." I leaned against the railing, keeping my expression calm. "Funny, Greg, you didn't care about wildlife laws when you threw that same shark into my pond." His face went crimson. "You can't prove that." "Oh, but I can," I said, holding up my phone. "See, unlike you, I actually keep my security footage. The sheriff's department already has a copy. Just in case anything happens to me or my land." Greg hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He turned to his board members, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. "Go home, Greg," I said, "before you embarrass yourself any more than you already have." He stormed off, muttering something about getting the last laugh. I didn't doubt him. 2 days later, it started. First, my property tax bill arrived, triple the normal amount. I called the county office, and they told me an anonymous complaint had flagged my land as non-agricultural, nullifying my tax exemptions. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. Then came the code inspectors. Out of nowhere, 3 different county departments showed up, claiming they'd received reports of illegal structures and hazardous waste on my farm. Each time I handed them coffee and walked them through the property, knowing full well I was clean. One of them, a grizzled guy from Environmental Services, leaned close as he left and whispered, "Off the record, Greg's making a lot of enemies in City Hall right now. Keep your head up, this'll turn." Meanwhile, Amanda was working her magic. She'd filed the lawsuit, sure, but she was also feeding tidbits of Greg's corruption to the press, carefully timed leaks designed to keep the HOA under constant public scrutiny. By the end of the week, Greg's name was everywhere. Local headlines screamed, "HOA president under investigation for embezzlement. Luxury development linked to forged zoning docs. Shark in the pool scandal goes viral." Derek, of course, was having the time of his life. "You realize," he said one night over beers, "you've turned this into the most entertaining HOA drama in state history, right?" "Good," I said, "because Greg still got cards to play." And boy, did he ever. The following Friday, just after sunset, I came home to find something strange: orange stakes driven into the ground along my southern property line. At first, I thought it was a survey crew, but then I found the notice nailed to, "Oh, my fence, notice of eminent domain. This land has been provisionally condemned for community development purposes by order of the HOA." I laughed so hard I nearly fell over. Greg was trying to seize my land, even though the HOA had zero legal jurisdiction over me. Amanda, on the other hand, didn't laugh. "This isn't just intimidation," she said when I showed her the notice. "This is fraud. If he actually filed any of this paperwork with the county, that's a felony." We decided to hit back hard. Derek discovered that Greg had been funneling HOA money into a shell company that purchased undeveloped lots on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The problem? Those lots had federally protected wetlands on them. We anonymously tipped off the EPA. 3 days later, a convoy of federal trucks rolled into the HOA. Agents taped off 2 entire blocks and started digging through files. Homeowners stood on their lawns, confused and furious, demanding answers from Greg, who suddenly stopped showing his face in public. But while Greg hid, his loyalists fought dirty. Late one night, I woke to the sound of tires on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, only to catch 2 masked men dumping bags of rotting garbage onto my driveway. "Really?" I shouted, and they bolted, diving into a black SUV and tearing off down the road. I thought about calling the sheriff, but I didn't bother. I didn't need them. Because the hidden cameras Derek installed last week? Yeah, they caught everything. By now, it wasn't just me versus Greg. It was me versus the entire HOA machine. But the thing about machines is, when one cog fails, the whole thing can come apart. And I was about to rip out the biggest cog of them all. By the time the EPA trucks rolled out of the HOA development, the community was a war zone, not with guns or fists, but with whispers, lawsuits, and neighbors turning against each other. Greg's reputation was shredded. The once untouchable HOA president who used to strut around the neighborhood like a king was now hiding in his McMansion with blackout curtains drawn, refusing to answer the door. But his loyalists, the same loudmouths who had spent months harassing me, weren't ready to give up control just yet. The cracks in their empire widened fast. It started with the homeowners themselves. See, most people living under the HOA had tolerated Greg's nonsense because they believed his promises. "We'll raise property values. We'll make this a luxury community. You'll thank us later." But when the EPA showed up, everyone realized Greg had been gambling their money on shady land deals. An emergency HOA meeting was called. Derek and I sat in the back, leaning against the wall, while Amanda perched in the front row like a hawk waiting for prey. Greg didn't even show up. Instead, his vice president, a woman named Cheryl, who wore more diamonds than a Vegas casino, tried to calm the room. "Please, everyone," Cheryl began, clasping her hands like a preacher. "We just need to stay united through this investigation. It's all a misunderstanding. Greg has our best interests at heart." The crowd exploded. "Best interests?" yelled one homeowner. "You used our dues to buy swampland we can't even build on." Another shouted, "And what about the special assessment fees? Where did those go, huh?" Cheryl stammered, her polished veneer cracking under the pressure. Someone in the crowd stood up and waved a printout of the EPA's report. "It says right here you lied on federal zoning documents. That's a felony, Cheryl." By the end of the meeting, 3 board members, Reezy, Ned on the spot. Cheryl left in tears. But Greg wasn't the kind of guy to go quietly. 2 days later, every mailbox in the HOA, and mine, even though I wasn't part of it, had a glossy newsletter stuffed inside. On the front page, in bold capital letters, it read, "Community under attack. Our peaceful neighborhood is being threatened by outsiders who want to destroy everything we've built." Greg had written a 4-page manifesto painting himself as the victim of a grand conspiracy, orchestrated by me, Amanda, and Derek, of course. The kicker? He accused me of harboring dangerous wildlife and creating an unsafe environment for residents. Translation: he was trying to make the shark incident my fault. Amanda laughed so hard when she read it that she nearly fell out of her chair. "Perfect," she said, grabbing her laptop. "This counts as defamation. We'll add it to the lawsuit." Derek, on the other hand, had a different idea. "We don't need to fight Greg with lawyers," he said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "We fight him with data." That night, Derek and I camped out in his garage with pizza boxes and a whiteboard, digging through public HOA records. What we found was gold. Greg had billed the HOA nearly $40,000 for community landscaping improvements. Except there was no record of any landscaping company ever being hired. He'd also signed personal checks from the HOA's account to a shell company registered under his cousin's name. And the pièce de résistance? He'd filed a fraudulent emergency permit that allowed him to drain a protected wetland for a golf course project that never existed. Derek cross-referenced all the documents, while Amanda drafted subpoenas for the financial institutions involved. By midnight, we had a bombshell dossier, enough to not only win my case, but potentially send Greg to prison. But before we could act, Greg made his boldest move yet. I woke up the next morning to find my farm's front gate chained shut with a bright red sign hanging from it. Property condemned, per order of the HOA Development Committee. They'd even spray-painted illegal livestock in huge white letters across my barn door. I swear my vision went red. I called Amanda and she picked up on the first ring. Greg crossed the line, I said. He just declared war. There was a pause, then her voice came through, cold and sharp. Good, she said. Then we'll burn the whole HOA down. That night, we filed an emergency injunction against the HOA to block any action against my property. At the same time, Derek leaked our dossier to every local news outlet and community forum he could find. By sunrise, it was trending statewide. Greg's carefully curated image as a visionary developer was gone. The HOA members were in open revolt, lawsuits were flying from every direction, and Greg himself had gone into hiding. But something told me he wasn't done yet. Because Greg wasn't fighting to win anymore. He was fighting to destroy me, even if he had to take the entire HOA down with him. If I thought Greg was finished after the injunction and the news leaks, I was dead wrong. That man wasn't just angry, he was desperate. 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of my sister screaming. I bolted out of bed and ran outside barefoot, heart pounding. Our barn, the one my great-grandfather built, the one where we'd raised goats, chickens, and horses for 4 generations, was on fire. Thick, black smoke curled into the morning sky, glowing orange at the base where the flames licked hungrily at the dry wood. The smell of burning hay, diesel, and singed feathers hit me like a punch to the gut. I grabbed the hose and shouted for my sister to call 911, but the flames were already roaring. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the roof had collapsed inward, and the animals we couldn't reach in time. I still can't think about it without my throat tightening. The fire marshal said it was likely accidental, something about a possible electrical short, but Derek didn't buy it. An electrical short? He scoffed, standing in the ruins of our barn 2 days later, kicking a charred beam with his boot. Yeah, sure. Totally normal for 50-year-old barns to spontaneously combust right after you expose a corrupt HOA president on the news. Amanda was less subtle. It's arson, she said flatly, flipping through her notes. Greg hired someone. I guarantee it. I wanted to believe she was wrong. I really did. But then we found proof. Derek installed a new security system on my property a week before the fire. Cameras, motion sensors, everything. When he pulled the footage from the night of the blaze, there it was. A man in dark clothes, face hidden under a hoodie, carrying a gas can. He walked right up to the barn, poured liquid along the base, lit a match, and jogged back toward the street where a black SUV waited with its headlights off. Amanda paused the footage and zoomed in on the license plate. That, she whispered, her jaw tightening, is Greg's car. We took everything straight to the sheriff. He stared at the footage for a long moment, then sighed. We'll open an investigation, but you need to understand. People like Greg have money. They know how to drag this out. Amanda wasn't having it. No, she said, slamming her palm on his desk. You don't get it. He didn't just burn a barn. He destroyed property, killed livestock, endangered lives, and retaliated against my client in an active legal dispute. You go after him now, or I'll file a complaint against your department for negligence. To his credit, the sheriff launched an investigation. But Greg wasn't arrested, not yet. In the meantime, Greg doubled down on his smear campaign. The HOA sent out another special bulletin claiming I had burned my own barn for insurance fraud. They accused me of trying to frame a respected community leader and warned residents not to fall for outside agitators. The problem for Greg was that nobody was buying it anymore. By then, Derek's leak had gone viral. The dossier had been picked up by a local investigative journalist, and within a week, Greg's face was on the evening news under the headline, HOA President Linked to Alleged Fraud and Arson Scheme. Even people who'd been blindly loyal to him were now demanding answers. But Greg wasn't finished with me. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel outside. I grabbed my shotgun and peered through the window. A truck I didn't recognize was parked just beyond the gate. Two men stood by the hood, whispering, pointing at my house. When I stepped onto the porch and racked the shotgun, the men scrambled back into the truck and sped off into the darkness. I called Amanda the next morning. "He's escalating," I said. "Then so are we," she replied. "It's time to hit Greg where it hurts." Over the next 2 weeks, Amanda filed 3 separate motions: a restraining order against Greg and any HOA representatives, a petition to dissolve the HOA's control over properties not originally under its jurisdiction, mine included, a civil lawsuit for damages, harassment, defamation, and now arson. Derek kept feeding evidence to journalists, and the story spread beyond our county. By the end of the month, Greg's name was being dragged on national HOA forums as the poster child for corruption and abuse of power. Still, Greg didn't back off. Because when a man like Greg feels cornered, he doesn't surrender. He goes nuclear. And I had no idea just how far he was willing to go. I thought I'd seen Greg at his worst when he burned my barn. I was wrong. Because what came next wasn't harassment, it wasn't intimidation, it was war. It started with the bank notice. I opened my mailbox one morning to find a thick envelope from Riverside First Bank, the same bank my family had used for generations. Inside was a notice of foreclosure proceedings. According to them, I was 6 months delinquent on my mortgage and had 30 days to pay $48,000 or they'd auction off my land. I nearly laughed when I read it, except my hands were shaking too badly. I didn't even have a mortgage. The farm had been paid off decades ago. Amanda stormed into the bank with me later that afternoon, demanding answers. The manager looked pale as he flipped through the file. This can't be right," he said slowly. "It shows a loan opened under your name 6 months ago for home improvements, signed and notarized." Amanda leaned forward. "Show me the signature." He turned the document around. It was my name, my handwriting, but not my signature. "This," Amanda said through gritted teeth, "is forgery, and I'm guessing Greg helped push it through." While Amanda dug into the bank records, Derek called me with more bad news. "Man, Greg's got connections," he said. "You know that construction company he runs on the side? Turns out one of their biggest contracts is with Riverside First Bank. If he leaned on someone there, he could have made this happen." I was furious. Greg wasn't just trying to bully me into submission anymore. He was trying to steal my land. That night, my sister found me sitting on the porch staring at the burned skeleton of our barn. "You're scaring me," she said softly, setting a cup of coffee beside me. "I'm fine," I lied. "No, you're not." I looked at her, and for the first time, I admitted what I'd been holding back. If Greg takes this farm, it's not just about us anymore. This land's been in our family for over 100 years. He doesn't just want to push us out. He wants to erase us. My sister nodded. "Then don't let him." Amanda called the next morning with a new plan. "We're going federal," she said. "If Greg's committing bank fraud, that's interstate wire fraud. That's FBI territory." By noon, she'd filed a formal complaint with the Bureau and handed over everything we had. The forged loan documents, the security footage of the arson, a list of bogus fines and harassment, the SWAT call that nearly traumatized my sister. Within days, 2 federal agents showed up at my property in dark suits, notebooks in hand. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, flashing a badge, "we've been assigned to investigate potential RICO violations tied to your local homeowners association." That was the first time I heard the word RICO, organized crime laws. This wasn't just Greg being Greg. This was a network. Amanda and I spent hours with the agents, laying out every detail. They were especially interested in Greg's HOA funds, his construction company, and his relationship with Riverside First Bank. The more we dug, the more rot we uncovered. HOA funds had been misplaced into Greg's company for maintenance projects that never happened. Greg's company had billed residents for fake repairs and upgrades, pocketing the cash. At least 3 board members had family working at Riverside First, signing off on shady loans like mine. Greg wasn't running an HOA. He was running a personal empire, using HOA bylaws as his weapon and residents as his bank. But Greg wasn't going to sit back and let us dismantle him. 2 nights later, a black SUV parked across from my driveway again. This time, the men didn't drive off when I came outside with the shotgun. One of them leaned out the window and shouted, "Back off the lawsuit, farmer, or next time it won't just be your barn." I raised the shotgun. "Step out of the car and say that again." The SUV screeched away into the night. The next morning, Amanda called me with the voice of someone who hadn't slept. "Pack a bag," she said. "What? Why?" "I just got a call from one of the federal agents. They intercepted chatter that Greg's guys are planning something bigger. We're putting you under protective watch." Protective watch?" I asked, heart pounding. "Amanda, what the hell are we dealing with here?" She hesitated, then finally said it. "Greg isn't just an HOA president. He's laundering money for people a lot scarier than him, and now you're in the middle of it." I thought this was just a fight against an HOA. Turns out, I was up against a criminal syndicate hiding behind one, and they weren't done coming after me. The day of reckoning came faster than I expected. By now, the FBI had spent weeks digging into Greg, his HOA, his construction company, and the crooked bank officers helping him run his empire. I thought that meant things would calm down, but instead, Greg got desperate. And desperate men are dangerous. It started just before dawn. I woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside. When I looked out my bedroom window, 3 black SUVs were parked at the end of my driveway, their headlights cutting through the morning fog. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and dialed Amanda, but before I could say a word, she answered, "Stay inside, lock your doors. The FBI's moving in today. Greg knows, and he's going to make a last play." I woke my sister, and we barricaded ourselves in the kitchen, the shotgun across my lap. Outside, men in dark clothing were shouting, their boots crunching on gravel. Then, over the noise, I heard Greg's voice. "Carter, this ends today. You think you can ruin me?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. Greg had burned my barn, tried to steal my land, terrorized my sister, and forged a mortgage in my name. And somehow, I was the villain in his story. "Go home, Greg," I yelled through the window. "The FBI's on their way." "They won't get here in time," he snarled. But just as he said it, a line of black sedans pulled up behind his SUVs, their doors flying open. "FBI, hands where we can see them." Chaos erupted. Greg tried to run. 2 of his board members tried to fight. One guy even pulled a weapon and was promptly tackled by 3 agents before he could aim. The sound of shouting, boots on gravel, and metal handcuffs snapping shut filled the air. Within minutes, Greg was face down on my driveway, his wrists bound behind him. "You can't do this," he screamed. "I own this neighborhood, you hear me? I own it!" One of the agents leaned down and said flatly, "Not anymore." Over the next few hours, the full scale of Greg's empire came crashing down. The FBI seized all HOA financial records, bank statements, and contracts. Greg's construction company was exposed as a front for embezzlement and money laundering. Riverside First Bank faced federal scrutiny for approving fraudulent loans, including the one forged under my name. And me? I was finally free. Every bogus fine, every fake complaint, every false loan tied to my name was wiped clean. Greg's personal empire was dismantled piece by piece, and his cronies on the HOA board were all indicted alongside him. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was the day my sister and I rebuilt the barn. Neighbors came from all around, hammering, hauling, and painting. People I barely knew brought food, tools, even livestock to replace what we'd lost. Turns out, Greg's downfall made headlines, and the community rallied behind us. Amanda visited that afternoon, leaning against a post with a rare smile. "You know," she said, sipping coffee, "you could sue the HOA for damages, emotional distress, arson, fraud." I looked out at the new barn frame rising in the sunlight and shook my head. "Nah, Greg's spending the next 20 years behind bars. That's enough for me." She raised an eyebrow. "That's very zen of you." "Not zen," I said, "just tired." A few months later, the HOA was restructured under federal oversight. The new board scrapped half the absurd bylaws, dissolved most of Greg's petty regulations, and refunded homeowners for years of fraudulent fines. My sister started sleeping through the night again. Our goats bleated happily in their rebuilt pen. The tractors rolled, the fields bloomed, and for the first time in years, I stood on my porch without scanning the street for SUVs. We had our farm. We had our peace. Greg tried to burn us down, but we rebuilt, stronger than before.